On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, my film review is The Godfather, followed by my segment, Allow Me to Explain. And it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is The Godfather, released in 1972, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, starring Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, James Caan, Robert Duvall, John Cazale, Talia Shire, Diane Keaton, and Sterling Hayden. Here is the synopsis of the film. It details the events of the Corleone crime family spanning from 1945 to 1955. The film is the first part of the saga detailing the events of the members of the Corleone family, from Don Vito Corleone, played by Marlon Brando, the head patriarch of the family and the head of one of the 6 crime families, Frito Corleone, played by John Cazale, the eldest brother who works and operates a casino out in Las Vegas to deal with the gambling portion of the crime syndicate. Sonny Corleone, played by James Caan, is the middle child of the family who is violent and hot-headed when it comes to the family business. Tom Hagen, played by Robert Duvall, the adopted son of the family who was brought in when he was young and now acts as the lawyer for the Corleone family. And the youngest son, Michael, played by Al Pacino, who at first does not want to be involved in the family business of becoming involved in the crime syndicate, but now is becoming engaged in the family business and becomes entrusted as Don Vito's successor. What do I think of this film? While I found nothing wrong in terms of the acting, directing, writing, lighting, cinematography, or anything else in this film, when I watched this film from beginning to end, how we as viewers are watching a film that normalizes organized crimes and makes the audience accept the Corleone family as the main heroes of this saga, when they are really anti-heroes who still commit horrendous crimes and violence. But it is done from a psychological aspect. Now, since I am a fan of detective novels, one would always wonder, what is it that in the United States and the world's fascination, that we have this fascination with mobsters and crime families and syndicates that make us want to learn more about it? Well, when you look at it from both the historical and the crime aspect of the story, you can see that mob families and organized crime are a part of the American history that is nothing more than a permanent stain that can never be removed, since it is also exported to other countries that also have influential power over different factions of society. The film, as I watched, provides a perfect example of the mob's influence on all the different factions of American society that is operated from behind the scenes. In the film, the Corleones have infiltrated and influenced unions, prostitution, gambling, and as I watched early in the film, the deal with narcotics, as Sonny brought it up to his father, Don Vito Corleone, is a territory that is strictly risky and something that they would never invest in, even though Don Vito comes from the old ways, and Sonny is more part of the new ways. And he mentions that there is a lot of dough in smuggling them and selling these drugs. Another portion of the film that plays out is in the middle of the story, is the war between the Corleone family and the other 5 crime syndicates that are meant to break the whole family apart as a whole, but also it deals with the crackdown on organized crime that takes place after the murders of both Sollozzo and Captain McCluskey, who was on Barzini's, played by Richard Conte, payroll. He was a corrupt law enforcement official in the film, played by Sterling Hayden. And Sollozzo, oh gosh, I forgot his name, but he's in this movie. Anyway, but on a historical aspect, the film is also a connection to the roots of the Corleone family going back to the island of Sicily when Michael was expatriated to Sicily after the murders of both Sollozzo and McCluskey. What we get in the film is that the connection, since Michael is able to connect to the residents and travel to the area known as Corleone in Sicily because of his Italian/Sicilian roots. But when you look at it from the aspect of what was going on historically when he's on the island of Sicily, you'll notice that there are some posters behind Michael, as well as some of the other residents in Sicily. Like, there are posters of the Italian Communist Party, the Sicilian Communist Party, the Socialist parties, all these other political groups that have begun to influence the Sicilian and Italian people at that time. While in the United States, there is a transition from the old ways of Don Vito, the main patriarch, the head whose crime syndicate took over politics both local and national, gambling in the West Coast, unions in the entertainment industry, and every other faction in American society, to the new ways when the other crime families are now becoming involved in narcotics, which Don Vito refuses to engage himself in. But it reflects on a new generation of the family that is now relying on these new tactics in the post-war era, that is now relying on the young blood within the Corleone family, such as Sonny and Michael, become engaged in, just after Don Vito was gunned down, but he was not killed as the next successor in the line of succession. So my stance in the film is that while I like that this film is an expose on the crime syndicate that has been a part of the American society and its history since the early 20th century, when the immigrant experience to Ellis Island for Eastern Europeans had lasted from the late 19th century up to the mid-20th century, that part was later explored in part 2, I had a mixed reaction to this film. I admired the story and the character progression from beginning to end, as well as the transition of the patriarch going from being the head of the family to now being a semi-retired individual, and the youngest becoming the head of the family as he transitions from being a shy and reluctant person to now accepting his outcome of becoming the head of the Corleone crime family. I am not, however, a fan of the darkest chapters of our American history that, as I mentioned, it can never be removed, and that has now become a part of American culture and has been popularized by the entertainment industry and also part of American politics that feels so present in our society today and that can never, ever be changed. Whenever you think of how organized crime has influenced every faction of society, it's the one thing that people always look up to whenever they look back on American history as well as recent history of organized crime in other parts of the globe. While the portrayal of the Corleone family in the film is fiction, the other historical, criminal, and psychological aspects that emerge from before and after the film, as well as the novel, is all too real to be made up. The journey began in 1969 when Mario Puzo's novel The Godfather was published and became an instant bestseller. Before the novel was published, it was in manuscript form. Paramount wanted to take this manuscript form as the next project for their studio. They contacted Puzo and offered him $12,500 for the rights of the novel and $80,000 if the novel were made into a film. Puzo accepted the deal and met with Robert Evans, who was then the head of Paramount Studios, in early 1968. The meeting was productive, and Puzo needed the money to pay off his gambling debts, so he was in. Paramount confirmed that they were backing Puzo's novel as their next project, and in 1969, they confirmed that they were going to adapt this novel as a film for $80,000 after the deal with Mario Puzo that I mentioned earlier. For this film, Robert Evans, the producer, wanted an Italian-American director to helm the project to make the film, quote, ethnic to the core, end quote. Several directors were considered to be approached to the project but later turned it down, including Sergio Leone, Peter Bogdanovich, who was Jewish, Peter Yates, Richard Brooks, Arthur Penn, Costa Gavras, and Otto Preminger. And then Francis Ford Coppola was suggested because of his Italian ancestry and because he worked on low-budget projects. But his recent project at the time, The Rain People, made in 1969, was poorly received. Coppola did not want the job since he found the novel, as he called it, sleazy and sensationalist and, quote, pretty cheap stuff, unquote. Coppola at the time was the founder of his own studio, American Zoetrope, and at the time the studio found itself in a real mess when it owed Warner Brothers over $400,000 for being over budget on their feature THX 1138, released in 1971. Because Coppola was in real dire straits from his financial standing at this time, he agreed to take the job. He agreed to receive $125,000 and 6% of the gross rentals. It was Coppola who improved on this script as a family chronicle and as a metaphor for American capitalism. Coppola and Puzo were each writing different versions of the screenplay, but managed to keep in contact with each other during the pre-production process. Coppola would work on drafting the screenplay in San Francisco, while Puzo worked on his draft in Los Angeles. They would later decide on which aspects of their screenplay would be in the final film and what would be left out of the film as a collaborative process. The script went through 3 drafts. The third draft was the final screenplay with uncredited work by Robert Towne. He did the dialogue for Brando and Pacino in the garden in the latter half of the film. For the main cast of the film, Puzo wanted the role of Vito Corleone to be played by Marlon Brando since he was, quote, the only actor who can play the Godfather, end quote, and also sent him a letter for this part. Paramount was against casting of Brando, and suggestions of who would play the role went from Laurence Olivier, who was suggested by Coppola, but he also favored Brando as well, whose agent told him that he was uninterested in playing the role, Ernest Borgnine, George C. Scott, Richard Conte, Anthony Quinn, and Orson Welles. After Coppola went to Brando's residence to film his audition tape and showed it to the executives over at Paramount, Brando won the part. Coppola wanted Robert Duvall to play the role of Tom Hagen, and he got the role, because Paramount granted him that wish. Other actors who were cast in the film included James Caan as the role of Sonny Corleone, Al Pacino, who was cast in the film as Michael Corleone, Diane Keaton was cast as Kay Adams, who was Michael's wife in the film, John Cazale was cast as Frito Corleone, and Coppola would later cast some of the members of his own family in the film, including Talia Shire, who is in real life Francis's sister, who was cast as Connie Corleone. Sofia Coppola made her film debut as a newborn child of Connie and Carlo Rizzi's son, Michael Francis Rizzi, and Francis's parents and sons were also extras in the movie. The film was entirely shot on location in New York, Sicily, and California. Filming lasted from March until August of 1971. The film was shown to the exhibitors at Paramount in December 1971 and also in January of 1972 before the film would be released to the main public. The world premiere of the film took place at Lowe's State Theater in New York City on March 14, 1972. The film was released nationwide on March 24th that same year. The film became the highest-grossing film of 1972 and was an immediate blockbuster. The film received positive critical praise and was nominated for every awards faction in the country as well as overseas, and it was also nominated, largely enough, at the Academy Awards. The film would win for Best Picture, Best Actor, Marlon Brando, and Best Adapted Screenplay, Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola. It has been recognized as one of the greatest films ever made and also the most influential. All I have to say is that although the film is meant to be portrayed as a drama film, I thought that it was more of an expose about how organized crime is portrayed as part of the American psyche, but also retains the humanistic aspects regarding familial portrayal with its on-screen characters. And I would say it's an okay film, not a film that I would say I'm going to praise it all and things like that, but I would look at it more as a film to examine further on the criminal psyche and the history of how organized crime is operated in the United States. We will be right back with Allow Me to Explain. I have been a devoted fan of animation known as anime, also known as Japanese animation, since I was very young. And yet, just when anime is reaching its peak, there are still signs that the industry is not taking the issues, including animators being paid low wages and the horrible working conditions that are making these problems very noticeable, seriously, and that there is also competition coming from China and other Asian countries that has got the industry on the defense. So why is it that even though we love watching anime shows from Japan, why the working conditions and wages are on the decline? Or if there are some positive solutions regarding the survival of the anime industry and what can be done. It's time for Allow Me to Explain. During the pandemic era, the demand to watch anime on streaming platforms was booming in Japan as well as abroad. But while the business in anime may seem like a good business profit for animators who want to get on board and work, the reality of the working environment for animators is more of a financial nightmare as well as a deadly trap. For newcomer animators who are not so lucky when entering the industry for the first time, they would get paid the American equivalent of $200 a month. And the industry has only widened this gap between the wages of the animators and the profits that they generate to the market. So animators would have to make a decision whether they can afford to work at this job as part of their passion or find another job that is not so strenuous and harsh. So, let's examine the history of how the abysmal working conditions and low wages affect the current state of the anime industry, and what are some of the slight improvements that some of the companies have been doing, and what needs to be done for the future of the anime industry in Japan. One of the earliest aspects of why the industry practices are putting animators in horrible working conditions and low wages stems from, as Roland Keltz calls it, the curse of Osamu. According to Roland Keltz, the phrase refers to the way in which famed auteur Osamu Tezuka captured the Japanese television market in the 1960s by selling his episodes cheap to keep others out through his animation studio. According to Michael Rose, who wrote a thesis on Osamu Tezuka for the undergraduate review, quote, even though his actions may have seemed like a deceitful plot, other scholars argue that Osamu did not intend to shut out other artists. What he actually aimed for was for his work to be well known, and in order to do that, he had to make sure his work was quickly bought up by companies who could broadcast it to the world, end quote. But instead of following Tezuka's lead, the other animation studios instead went ahead to produce a large number of animated works at a reduced cost. The dynamic gap was further pushed in the 1980s as animation studios took financial risks as they entered joint ventures. It was an effort to support specialization, investment, and risk management. By the next decade, the Anime Production Committee was assembled regarding the grim realities of the anime industry. The simple definition of it is, a production committee is a joint venture subsidiary company created by various entities with the goal of producing a form of entertainment. In other words, two companies work together to make an animated project. An example from this product trend was Akira from 1988. It was an expensive animated project that had an estimated budget of $5.5 million. This approach would give animation studios the resources and security that would get their animated projects to the public and getting their projects to be in demand. The creators, however, would receive a fee in return instead of a share of the profits that would be shortchanged either because of red tape, legal pitfalls, or lack of financial understanding. Around this same time in the 1980s decade, the anime industry began outsourcing animation work to South Korea and other countries to maximize production and began hiring freelancers and volunteers through social media in the 21st century. According to a survey conducted in 2019 by the Japanese Animation Creators Association, they found that the animators had an average annual salary of $44,370. The average figures, however, present a dysfunctional experience amongst the individual animators in their experiences. Around 40% of young animators and support staff reportedly earned less than $28,000 annually. Animators, including producers, worked about 230 hours a month, which is 11.5 hours a day, 5 days a week. Because the cost of living in and around the city of Tokyo is high, the low wages shine a light on why animators feel bitter and angered for getting so little while working on animated projects in the industry. These reports about the long hours and wage pay were reported as early as 2004. So the Japanese Animation Creators Association was founded in 2007 to advocate for the improved working conditions at the anime industry. It is like a watchdog group to keep an eye on track these issues in the industry at large. According to the New York Times, quote, the problem stems partly from the structure of the industry, which constricts the flow of profits to studios. But studios can get away with the meager pay in part because there is a nearly limitless pool of young people passionate about anime and dreaming of making a name in the industry, said Simona Stanzami, who has worked in the business as a translator for nearly 3 decades. There are a lot of artists out there who are amazing, she said, adding that studios have a lot of cannon fodder. They have no reason to raise wages, end quote. Justin Savakis, founder of Anime News Network and chief executive of Media OCD, told the New York Times, quote, studios are typically run by creatives who want to make something really good. They'll try to bite off way too much and be way too ambitious. By the time they're done, they have very possibly lost money on the project. Everyone knows that it's a problem, but unfortunately, it's so systemic that no one really knows what to do about it. And even though the long working hours appear to violate Japan's labor regulations, Jun Sugawara, activist and animator, said, quote, that authorities have taken little interest even though the government has made anime a central part of its public diplomacy efforts through its Cool Japan program. So far, the national and local governments don't have any effective strategies for dealing with the issue. Cool Japan is a meaningless and irrelevant policy, end quote. While it seemed as if the working conditions and pay wages were going unanswered and have not led to a real solution, and have been leading to a number of negative and depressing headlines regarding the state of the anime industry in Japan, there has been, however, slow and steady progress. Before the pandemic, the 2019 survey by the Japanese Animation Creators Association showed a positive development. Animators' average annual salaries were 10% higher than those of employees in other industries in the private sector. It is one of the best improvements over the animators' salary levels from 2009, when animators received a pay average of $22,600 per year, which is below the norm for a private sector in Japan, sort of a compare and contrast. While other animation companies examine what is wrong in the industry, some studios and creators push for positive change. Kyoto Animation, for example, is known for its familial philosophy approach to how they treat the animators at their studio, but also has an in-house production system from its dedicated training program. Another studio, Ufotable, I might have mispronounced it, founded its own school and provided its alternative sources of funding for their animators. While these are some positive solutions and improvements that have been addressed recently, it is important to show respect for the animators who need to be treated at the same pay and respect for following the passion that they love to do, that I hope would be a life lesson in the future. This has been Allow Me to Explain. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, and Google Podcasts every Friday. Make sure to go to my blog website at Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez podcast.wordpress.com with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. And if there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.